Welcome back to Through the Valley. This is your host, Bahar Alexander, executive coach, author, and speaker. One of the greatest misconceptions about decision making is that people believe decision making only applies to major life events. Taking a job, leaving a relationship, launching a company, making an investment, deciding to relocate, promoting someone, firing someone. But leadership decision making is happening constantly. Every action is a decision. Every avoidance of action is also a decision. Every silence, every delay, every negotiation, every boundary not set accurately, every truth not spoken entirely, every over explanation, every yes said when the body clearly screams no. All of it reflects decision making agility. And this becomes critically important at higher levels of leadership because senior leadership requires altitude, and altitude requires agility. At lower levels of leadership, people can sometimes compensate for poor decision making through effort, execution, or technical competence. But at higher altitude, hesitation compounds faster, distortions compound faster, misalignment compounds much faster. Because the consequences ripple through teams, through culture, relationships, strategy, and organizational trust, both internally and with external stakeholders. A delayed conversation becomes resentment. An avoided boundary becomes burnout. An unspoken truth becomes organizational confusion, leading to unnecessary ambiguity. A fear-based hire becomes a long-term cultural disruption. A leader staying too long in misalignment slowly erodes their vitality, their creativity, and their authority. And what's dangerous is that most leaders think these are isolated events, but they're not isolated. They're compounded go and no-go decisions happening daily. And these decisions are rarely made from pure logic alone. They're filtered through internal architecture, which brings us into today's conversation. Decision-making at architecture phase. Because here's the truth. Most leaders believe they're making rational decisions, but many decisions are actually being filtered through subconscious survival architecture automatically. And until we become aware of that architecture, we confuse reactivity for intuition, urgency for clarity, control for leadership, and fear for discernment. Recently, I shared an analogy on LinkedIn about a spaceship taking off from Earth. When a spaceship first launches, the greatest amount of fuel is required at the beginning phases of this journey because the spaceship is working hard against the gravitational pull of the Earth. That pull represents density, resistance, conditioning, identity, fear, survival mechanisms. When we talk about leadership transformation, we're talking about a spaceship taking off from Earth. Elevation through leadership represents the exact analogy of this spaceship moving towards its destination from gravitational pull. As we begin moving towards greater awareness, greater alignment, and greater inner authority, we experience internal gravitational resistance. The old self pulls, the nervous system pulls, ego pulls, and survival strategies pull at us. Not because we're weak, but because the system is attempting to preserve familiarity. And nowhere is this more visible than decision making. especially during the architecture phase, because this is the phase where leaders begin confronting the deeper psychological structures underneath their patterns. Why do I overcontrol? Why do I hesitate? Why do I overexplain? Why do I seek certainty? Why do I avoid conflict? Why do I need applause with every step I take? Why do I become reactive under pressure? Why do I stay too long? Why do I leave too early? These are all very important pattern related questions. The architecture phase is where leaders begin realizing my patterns are not random. There is architecture beneath them. And this is where leadership becomes deeply personal. Because many people believe their dissatisfaction in leadership or life is circumstantial. They think it's the company, it's the relationship, it's the timing, it's the market, it's my team. And sometimes these things do matter. But often, more often than not, beneath chronic dissatisfaction is something much deeper. An internal architecture repeatedly generating distorted choices, distorted interpretations, distorted relationships, and distorted responses to fear activation. Which means without integration, the external environment changes, but the internal patterns continue reproducing similar outcomes, similar results. Different environment, same architecture. Different relationship, same architecture. Different opportunities, same architecture. And eventually, leaders realize they are the common denominator. They realize the valley is not just about changing circumstances. It's about restructuring the internal architecture, generating the decisions. And today, I want to introduce another layer to this framework. I believe people exist somewhere along a psychological spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum is what I call the identified grandiose self. On the opposite end is the projected self-conscious self. And in the middle is what I call discernment zone. But this spectrum is not a flat line. It behaves more like an inverted U or a horseshoe. Because although the extremes appear opposite from an external perspective, they often create similar levels of distortions internally and the same level of chaos. One extreme compensates through inflation and the other compensates through contraction, but they're both compensating. One says, I already know, the other says, I'm not enough. Both are deeply activated states. Both distort perception. Both distort calibration. Both distort decision making. And both are often unconsciously driven by survival strategies. Specifically, the 5 survival strategies developed to avoid the exposure of core emotional wounds we've developed in our formative years. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fall apart. If you haven't listened to my previous podcast episodes, I would strongly urge you to do that to get more information about the survival strategies. It gives you a better context as you listen to this episode. Underneath these strategies often live deeper fears: fear of abandonment, rejection, humiliation, betrayal, and injustice. This means many leadership decisions are actually not strategic. They're protective. Some leaders make decisions from over certainty because uncertainty threatens their identity, and others delay decisions because visibility feels dangerous. Some dominate conversations to avoid vulnerability, others over-adapt to avoid rejection. Some leaders prematurely exit opportunities because discomfort activates old wounds. Others stay in environments long after alignment is gone because fear of loss overrides their truth. This is why self-awareness alone, which is what is often taught in leadership development courses, is insufficient. A leader can intellectually understand themselves and still remain governed by subconscious survivor calibration. The deeper work is integration. Integration changes where we land on the spectrum. And this is important. The goal is not to eliminate doubt completely. Healthy leadership actually requires some degree of doubt. Enough doubt to remain curious, enough doubt to continue growing, enough doubt to challenge blind spots, but not so much doubt that it collapses movement. Discernment lives in the middle, the golden mean, where there is enough self-trust to act and enough humility to remain open, enough confidence to lead, and enough awareness to question distortions. This is where decision-making becomes cleaner. Not perfect, and that is not what we're looking for. Cleaner, less reactive, less emotionally hijacked, and less driven by unconscious protection. And this is where leadership begins shifting from performance into embodiment, from external validation into inner authority. Because leadership maturity is not the absence of fear or doubt. It is the ability to recognize when fear is attempting to drive our decisions. And this process is not linear. As our capacity grows, we revisit these dynamics from higher levels of awareness. The same way a spaceship continues adjusting as it exits Earth's gravitational field, moving towards its destination. Growth requires recalibration again and again and again. Before we close, I want to leave you with 3 reflective exercises. Not to judge yourself, but to observe your architecture more honestly and to help you integrate the information you've just listened to. Exercise 1 is about tracking your daily go and no-go decisions. For 1 week, I want you to begin noticing your micro decisions. Where do you move forward? Where do you hesitate? Where do you over-explain? Where do you stay silent? Where do you avoid? Where do you rush? Observe the patterns without immediately trying to fix them. Because at this point, information is everything, and patterns reveal architecture. Exercise 2 is about identifying the fear beneath the decision. So the next time you feel emotionally activated around a decision, I want you to ask yourself, what feels threatening right now? Is it rejection? Is it failure? Is it loss? Exposure? Perhaps humiliation? Maybe loss of control or abandonment? Often the nervous system is not reacting to the decision itself. It's reacting to what the decision symbolically represents. And that is important information. Brings you a step closer to that flawed architecture that requires transformation. Exercise 3 is about locating yourself on the spectrum. This is very important, and it needs to be done honestly. Ask yourself, when under pressure, do I move toward over-identification and certainty, or toward projection and self-consciousness? Do I compensate through control or through contraction? And then ask, what would discernment look like here? Not inflated confidence, thinking you already know it all, but also not collapse, thinking you will never get it right. Discernment, because leadership maturity is not built at the extremes. It is cultivated in the ability to remain regulated, both mentally and emotionally, enough to perceive clearly while moving through uncertainty. And that is inner authority. This is the valley, not punishment, not failure, but the restructuring of internal architecture. And through that restructuring, our decision making changes, our relationships change, our leadership changes, and eventually, our entire way of relating to ourselves and to others changes. Thank you for joining me on Through the Valley and listening to this episode. If this conversation supported your growth, take it one step further, integrate it. And if you're curious about your survival strategies and you would like to take the assessment, I've just recently made it available on my website. The link to the assessment will be below. It is a great entry point to doing the integration work. Please follow the podcast, share it with someone committed to their evolution, and leave a review. Your voice matters, and it helps expand this work to leaders ready to lead from within, as well as help me improve the podcast in ways that is meaningful for everyone who tunes in to listen. And for now, I will leave you with this. Shift your psychology to shift your energy and shift your leadership. Until next time.